I'm a chemical engineer, and I have worked all my life in the heavy industry in various fields. And I retired some years ago, and after that, I started working seriously with energy and climate issues. And I'm the author of 3 books on the topic in Danish, unfortunately, which is a language nobody understands. And then I'm also the editor of the only climate realistic web page in Denmark, where we do everything in Danish language, because even though Danes are known to be quite proficient in English, they're not good enough, and they prefer to have it in Danish. And that's what I cater for. So that is a topic for this evening. That's solar and wind as energy sources. Now, I don't know much about the audience, but just to make it a little more clear, I want to spend 1 minute on energy and power, which is an issue which is always confused by journalists, no matter how skilled they are otherwise. But when you talk about power, it's about energy per second. So if you have an old-fashioned 60-watt bulb, that tells you how much power it uses per second. And it means that if you keep it on for 2 hours, you will have spent 120 watt hours. So you multiply the time by the power. If you take a toast machine, which would be 1,000 watts or 1 kilowatt, and you run that for 2 hours, then you have spent 2 kilowatt hours. Moving on to a car, 60 kilowatts motor, smaller car, that would be 80 horsepower. And running that for 2 hours flat out, you will have spent 120 kilowatt hours. Next step is a wind turbine, 8,000 kilowatts or 8 megawatts. For 2 hours, it will have produced 16 megawatt hours, because spending and producing is the same units we're using here. And finally, we have the power plant, 500 megawatts, which would be a typical line. Running that for 2 hours would give you 1,000 megawatt hours or 1 gigawatt hour. So now we have the whole scale here. Moving on to the electric supply. It says here scenario, and that means that these figures here are from a Danish government agency scenario for 2035, where they basically wanted to have expanded the wind and solar so much that it can cover the entire consumption of electricity in the country. What you see here is the demand or the load in a typical day. At nighttime, it's lower, then it ramps up in the morning, and then you get a peak around 1700 hours, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when everybody comes home and starts cooking. And then it drops down in the evening. So this would be the typical load. And in the good old days, we would do that by having coal, oil, or gas-fired power plants. At the bottom, we would have the base load. Running more or less stable. That could be a coal-fired plant. Then you have some kind of combined plants, which in some cases also could supply district heating. So they will both supply power and district heating at the same time, which gives a very good utilization of the energy. And then finally, you have what you call the peaker plant, which is the one that has to follow the consumption. So whenever somebody turns on the TV, then at the power plant, they have to increase a little bit. And when you switch it off again, they will have to decrease a little bit. And they have to keep up, because the key to all this is that the production and the supply must match 100%, very accurately, second by second.
I have a question.
Yes.
How much overproduction is there in reality? Because you don't want to be under.
There's no overproduction. The production has to match the consumption 100%. Exactly. If you
Oh,
overproduce, then you overload your transformers and your network and you burn it off. If you underproduce, you lose the frequency and everything trips. Both
so they get it
cases are
that
destructive.
much, that close to one hair dryer. They can.
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
And this is a very important point that many people don't realize. But the art of keeping an electricity supply running is maintaining this balance all the time. And we will get back to all the difficulties entailed in that. So that's an important point. Now let's see. Now this was the 2035 scenario. So we have solar and wind, which combined matches the consumption. So let's look at the same day what the production from solar and wind looks like. The blue curve is the one you saw before. The red one is what we got from wind and solar on that day. It's only at one moment around 10 o'clock that the two match. Otherwise, they are far apart from each other. Okay, now this Mr. Hansen, he took a bad day just to prove his point. But look at this. This is some 3 weeks from the same data. And you can see every day, you have the consumption is a blue curve, meandering up and down here. And then you have the production from solar and wind all over the place. Sometimes too little, sometimes too much. Only once, maybe twice a day, do they match for 1 or 2 seconds. Otherwise, they're totally out of sync.
Here we see the weekends here.
Yeah, it's somewhere in there. Frankly, I don't. That must be, for instance, here
Yeah,
where the
right.
consumption is
Yeah,
lower. Yeah.
yeah, right. Okay.
Okay. And if we take the whole year, if you take the average production from wind and solar, it matches the average consumption. So, and that was the purpose of the whole thing. But they never match. And you can see that sometimes you have virtually zero, even though you have a huge amount of wind turbines and solar cells. Sometimes you're close to zero in production. You're actually at zero here. At other times, you're up to more than double the consumption, maybe almost 3 times the consumption. Okay. These are figures from last year, March 2023, just showing the wind alone. So this is wind without the solar. Again, the consumption is the dotted line here, and you have the production from the wind going up and down. We don't have enough wind turbines right now. We do have enough to match the consumption if they all run at full power, because we have around 7,000 megawatts, but they rarely do that. But you can see sometimes they actually do fulfill the whole need. Similar for sun. Denmark has 3,600 megawatts of solar cells installed, and this is what they produced last year, the whole year. And again, we have the consumption is the blue up here. Now, here's a very interesting point also, because Denmark is a country far to the north, a little further north than Great Britain, but not too much. And you can see that during summertime, we have a fair production of energy, electricity from the solar panels. But during wintertime, November, December, and January, it's almost nothing. It's actually less than 10% of the output in summertime. And there are two reasons for that. One is that the inclination of the sun is very low. It's very low in the sky. And the second thing is that we have a lot of clouds in wintertime in Denmark. And then, of course, with solar cells, every night you get nothing. Every day you get up to the peak performance, and every night you get nothing. So solar is something very difficult to handle. And my personal view is that for Scandinavia, parts of Germany, the UK, solar doesn't make any sense. This is from the Danish Energy Transmission Company. This is just one day, one solar farm 158 megawatts. This was so it will be isolated in one field. We used to grow wheat on that field, but now we have covered it with black plates instead. And what you see here is, because this was a day with drifting clouds, you see how much the production varies. It is close to zero, jumps up, jumps down, comes all the way up to 120, and then down again to almost nothing. And since we know that the consumption is pretty steady and requires a pretty steady supply, somebody else will have to fill in all these holes here in the supply from the solar cells. That is a huge challenge. Germany has many bad things and many good things. They have some nice words, and one of those I really love is Dunkelflaute, which means a period of darkness or what do you call it, sunset. And this is a word that covers periods where you have no sun and no wind, which means that your solar cells and your wind turbines produce nothing or next to nothing. And we actually just a couple of weeks ago, we had a small Dunkelflaute here in Denmark. You see the consumption, that's a black curve up here. You have the blue curve, that's the wind, and the yellow curve is the sun. And you can see that during these 3 or 4 days here, they were nowhere near the consumption. Then the Danish government is planning a huge expansion of wind turbines and solar cell capacity. Actually, they want to have 12 times the number of solar cells and 7 times the number or the capacity of wind turbines. Now, if we had had that this week, a couple of weeks ago, the picture would have looked like this. You can see that from the 4th and onwards, at no time do the solar panels and the wind turbines supply enough power. They are nowhere near the demand. And here I've been nice because I've still shown the 2024 demand, but the plans, of course, are that the whole country will be electrified at that time, and we will have a much bigger demand for power. But solar and wind cannot supply. We will get back to the Dunkelflaute a little later. One consequence of this situation, because obviously we have to rely on other sources than our solar and wind. And one consequence is that the spot prices of electricity are fluctuating wildly. I believe that's the case in the UK also, and certainly it is in Germany. And you can see here, this is a period in April this year, price vary between negative, minus 50 euro per megawatt hour, and up to, well, 180 euro per megawatt hour. Up and down it's going. It's interesting to see that the price actually becomes negative now and again. And that, of course, is a result of having a lot of wind turbines and a lot of solar cells, because on sunny days with a lot of wind, already today in Denmark, we produce a lot more than we can use. So that has to be sold or given away to the neighbors, either Germany or Norway and Sweden normally. Also the UK, we have a line. But they also have a lot of wind and a lot of sun. So they don't want it. And then we have to pay them money to take it. And that's what we do. And that's how we get the negative prices. And what you can see here is the development in number of hours with negative prices from 2010 until this year. I think it's September included. There was a dip.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Soren, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Who is this we that you spoke of when you said we have to pay?
The producers have to pay. Somebody have to pay.
Okay. So it's the generator will pay to someone to take.
Yes, but that depends on what kind of contract the generator has. because in the UK you have a contract for difference where the government will pay. So the government will pay the guaranteed price to the generator plus the negative price on top of that. In Denmark, we have a mixture of different contracts. Some are at market conditions. So here the producers will have to pay. The more solar cells you install, the worse this problem gets. In Germany, it's getting very bad now. Because during these sunny days, if you have more solar capacity than you have demand, then every day you will have a surplus of power and negative prices. The next step, of course,
in that situation just described with solar, is it possible at the field level to turn a solar panel off and regulate the amount that's going through it?
Yeah, that is the next step. And that goes for solar panels, also for wind turbines.
Right.
In Germany, the government has organized this pretty neatly. They have a web page where every day you can see how much they have switched off. It's worse in the summertime, of course. And they do that because they cannot get rid of the power, even though they offer money. Then they still cannot get rid of the power. And in order not to burn off the whole electrical installation, they have to force the producers to switch off.
Right.
And quite a lot of that is by now remote control, so they will just do it.
Sorry. Hi, Soren.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're building a huge lithium battery storage local to me here. So the argument will be that excess can be stored.
We will get back to that.
Okay, good.
Yes. But what you see here is a steady development in the number of hours with negative prices. In the good old days, until say 2016, it was mainly because the wind turbines were producing too much. But since then, it's obviously the solar which is taking over. There was a dip in connection with the energy crisis because prices were very high. So if you offered a lower price, everybody was happy. But since then, after this effect has gone away, it's just going upwards and it'll get worse and worse. So this year we will get more than 300 hours of negative prices. And these will very often be the most productive hours for the owners of solar cells. So it's a cost to them also. Yeah. So what do we do?
I do have a quick question.
Yeah.
What if you pay someone to take your electricity, what happens to it? Because they don't need it at that same time. So where does it go?
Well, what happens is that Norway and Sweden will, for instance, they will take power and take the money also, and then they will turn down their hydroelectric power, which is very flexible. To some extent, Sweden can also down-regulate the nuclear power, but that's a little more difficult.
Yeah.
So they will switch off whatever they can, and then they will take the money and the power from
But
outside.
this happens minute by minute.
Yes.
Wow.
It happens actually. The power prices are fixed for either 30 minutes or 1 hour at the time. I will get back to that in a little while. But the question now is, what do we do? Until very recently, nobody wanted to hear about nuclear power. I think the mood is changing a little bit. And of course, we don't want anything that's spewing out carbon dioxide. So, what are we talking about? If you look at these big reports where they mention the transition to green energy, and this is the International Energy Agency, this is the Danish, the UK, the US government agencies, they will all point out to these points that I've mentioned here. A more flexible demand, regional cooperation, and energy storage, which is batteries or hydrogen. And we will take these in turn. Demand flexibility. Yes, you can, if you have an electric car, you can refrain from charging it if there is a shortage of power in the network. You can also stop your washing machine and tumble dryer, whatever else you got. But that's not much. And you can't do that for days. I mean, if you have to go to work tomorrow and you have a Dunkelflaute, then you cannot not refrain from charging your car, because then you're not going anywhere tomorrow. So that is rather limited what can be done. And then you have all the functions of the community, transportation, lighting, hospitals, public offices, and so on. All that has to keep running. So there's no saving there. And also in your home, if you have an electric heat pump, which is very modern, then you cannot switch that off, yes, for a few hours, but not for days if it's a winter day. And you still have to cook your food, and you need some light in your home. So demand flexibility is rather limited. And we will get back to that question a little later when we talk about hydrogen. But it's not the solution to all our problems here. And then we come to the regional cooperation. The basic philosophy is that if we have no wind and solar no wind or sunshine in Denmark, they will have it in the UK or in Germany or Norway and Sweden. So we can always get the power from somebody else. And in order to facilitate that, they have created all these cables, connections, where you can exchange power between Norway and Jutland, Sweden and Zealand and Germany. Jutland, Germany is a land border, and more cables like that. And this is basically the system that keeps, for instance, the Danish electricity supply afloat. Because we import a lot of power, and sometimes we also export a lot of power. And if we hadn't these very nice neighbors, Norway and Sweden, to take it and to deliver to us when we need it, we would be in big trouble with our energy. The UK is a little bit in the same situation. They get a little bit from France, but it's not very big cables, not yet, but they're planning to have more if the French agree. Germany have a huge surplus of wind and solar capacity, and sometimes they also have Dunkelflauten, and they get nothing. And then they have to run their remaining coal plants. They have to import power from France. They import from Denmark also, which then again comes from Norway through Denmark and to Germany. And also they import coal-fired power from Poland. And it's the only thing that keeps this whole circus running. And I must admit, they're doing a splendid job. We have very few power cuts in Denmark and no national power cuts since 2006. So they're doing a tremendous job. What they do is they sit down every day and they have an auction. Who can supply how much hour by hour tomorrow? And at what cost? And then the puzzle is simply laid out. Okay, this hour you will supply at that cost. The next hour you will supply at that cost, etc., etc. And every day they do that, and it works remarkably well. But it's getting more and more stressed because there's coming in more and more solar and wind power. France, with all the nice nuclear plants, are much less affected by all this. And sometimes they help out Germany and the UK when things go bad. But this
Soren,
Yeah.
is that a bilateral discussion or some sort of multilateral where all the countries speak at the same time and compete?
It's multilateral. And how they do it in reality, I must confess, I don't know in details, but it is everyday conferences between all the parties. Denmark has two cooperations, one with the North called Nord Pool, and then the other one, which is called EPEX with the rest of Europe. But Nord Pool and EPEX cooperate as well. So it's simply a big puzzle that is being laid out every day to fix.
Ask a question, Soren, please.
Yeah.
Are you saying that at the moment, Denmark has no power supply other than its renewables, and you have to get everything else, the peak demand has to come from elsewhere?
We have a little bit of coal-fired plants left. They don't want to run them because it doesn't look good on the climate accounts. And we have biomass-fired power plants, which also supply district heating. They are able to supply, in principle, almost all of our needs, but at a very high cost. So it's rarely used to the full extent. Instead, we prefer to buy from Norway, Sweden, or whoever can supply. We do, in theory, still have enough capacity to back up our own supply. But the plans are that this capacity is to be reduced below the threshold.
The biomass comes from where?
Haha, good question. I had left that out of the presentation, but I can mention it. We import biomass from North America, sometimes South America, and also the Baltic states here.
It's wood chips.
Wood chips and pellets.
And
Wooden
pellets
pellets.
from North Carolina.
Yeah. And it's supposed to be, renewable. It's supposed to be not hurting the forests or anything, but what happens in fact is that they cut them down from one end and sell the pellets. There's a huge market in Europe. Germany is using a lot also. Country like Romania has a huge export of pellets to Europe. Half of them are official and the other half are smuggled outside government regulations. Sustainable, that was a word. It's supposed to be sustainable, but it isn't. And Denmark is currently using 2 or 3 times the amount of biomass that actually is regarded as available to each citizen of the world. So we're using a lot more than the rest. And we're still saying that we want to be a front runner. We want to show the rest of the world how to do. And we do it by plundering the rest of the world of their trees. So that's not very nice. And the IPCC has mentioned it. The EU Commission is mumbling about this problem. And even the Danish, the Climate Council in Denmark is also mentioning that we cannot go on. But without the wood, we cannot fulfill any of our climate goals.
But the solution is so simple. Just more CO2 will make the trees grow faster.
Exactly.
So we can get more pellets.
Yeah, but that's not a popular point of view.
They just start pumping in the CO2 to the forest.
Yeah, well, they could do that. Yes. No, it's. I mean, we are. Last year, Denmark was on paper 45% of our energy consumption was renewable, which is close to a world record. Not electricity, but energy. But 2/3 of that is biomass, and a lot of that is imported biomass. And if you take that into account, it's not so impressive. Yeah, shall we move on?
Sure.
This is the situation in Denmark. This is a week in end of June last year. And what you see here is the top line up here is the Danish power consumption. And the production is solar, which is yellow, wind, which is green, onshore wind, and offshore wind is the light blue here. Then you have these biomass plants and production from small plants and so on, which is very little since this is summertime and they are basically there for the heat. And all the shortfalls then are covered by imports, which is the gray. So we are importing a lot Wednesday and Thursday. We're importing a little bit Friday, Saturday again. And then sometimes our wind and solar produces far too much, and then we export. And you can see that our export is actually something like more than 3,000 megawatts out of a consumption of 4,500. So 2/3 of our consumption that day we had to export. At other times, we are importing up to 3,000 megawatts, again out of 4,500. So again, it's something like 2/3.
So you can see, Soren, at the outset, you told us that we should talk in terms of megawatt hours. Surely these are just capacity numbers we're looking at.
Yeah, because these are the hourly capacity. That's normally the way we do it. We don't add up megawatt hours. So you can say if this is for 1 hour, it is 4,000 megawatt hours in this hour here. But it's easier to look at it as megawatts all the way through.
Okay.
Now what you see here is, and this is a picture that we saw at the start, that sometimes the wind turbines produce a lot, and the solar also. At other times, together, they produce almost nothing. And in order to get the system working, we have to do this import and export. And now Denmark is supposed to be a front runner. So we are supposed to show the rest of the world how to do. But this, what you see here, would not be feasible without Norway and Sweden. Germany cannot help us because Germany has solar and wind in step with ours. So when we don't produce, they don't produce either, and vice versa. So it is Norway and Sweden primarily that helps us, thanks to their nuclear power and not the least the hydroelectric power. So Denmark as a front runner, we have not solved the problem of basing the electricity supply on solar and wind.
But what about fossil fuel power from Norway and Sweden? Don't they have lots of natural gas, oil?
Yeah, but they don't use it for power production.
No?
No. Norway is 80 or 90% hydroelectric. Now some clever guys have started installing wind turbines in Norway, but that makes absolutely no sense. And Sweden is also, the north of Sweden, they also have a lot of hydropower, and then they still have some nuclear power plants left. So they don't use very much fossil fuels either. But Germany does, and mainly coal and lignite, because they are really in trouble every time the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. But we talk about regional cooperation, and people say, yes, but if in one place the wind doesn't blow, then it does in others, and we can all cooperate. And I made this very simple little example here, where you have 5 fictive regions or countries or whatever you would call them. Each of them have an average consumption of 20 gigawatts, and they have generating capacity of 20 gigawatts. And that's what they generate in order to meet the demand, and everybody's happy. Now, what happens if one of them, the generation fails? There's no wind here. Well, then the other 4 regions could chip in with an additional 5 gigawatts, and then everybody would still be happy. So they would need a capacity, of course, more than the 20 gigawatts, at least 25, in order to cater for a situation like this one here. But that looks beautiful, doesn't it? But now what if 4 out of 5 regions fail? That means that the 5th region, and that could be any of the 5, would need a capacity of 100 gigawatts. So it could deliver the 20 gigawatts to each of the other regions. But that means that all of them should have 100 gigawatts. And that means that under normal circumstances, they have far too much capacity. Also, they would need some huge cables for this thing here. So that looks a little more doubtful, doesn't it? And then we come back to the Dunkelflaute. Now we are back to the 5th of November. You remember the slide I showed you in Denmark, where there was no wind and no sun. This is the wind speed in all of Europe. And the green is down 5 to 10 kilometers per hour. And 1 meter per second is 3.6 kilometers per hour. So 10 is less than 3 meters per second. And this, incidentally, is the limit where wind turbines will start producing. Below 3 meters per second, they don't produce. They might still turn around, but they don't produce power. So basically, a very large part of Europe simultaneously had no wind. Even out at sea, it was very limited how much wind there was. This is what we call a Dunkelflaute. And you can see the situation in Germany the same week, the 5th, 6th to the 10th of November. Consumption up here, the production from onshore wind offshore wind and solar. And notice the capacities in Germany. They have 93 gigawatts of solar, which is 1.5 times the average consumption. And wind is 71 combined, which is also more than the consumption. And yet they give nothing. So regional cooperation is a little doubtful. So what do we do if all the countries have a low output like this, 5 gigawatt each? Then where does the power come from? Then one of you mentioned storage of electricity. And now we will look at that. We will look at batteries, hydrogen, and power to X. Batteries is by far the most technically feasible solution, because you store your electricity directly, you can get it out at will, and the losses are relatively small. You say 5 to 10% in a round trip. So if you have put in 100 kilowatt hours, you will get maybe 90, 95 kilowatt hours out again. So what's not to like about the batteries? Batteries are tricky. I don't know if you realize that, but a big battery like the one I just showed you is made up of little cells like this one here. So a car battery of 60 kilowatt hours will typically contain around 6,000 cells. And they, of course, have to be connected and hooked up and controlled, and you have to make sure you don't take out too much power or too little power. So there's a lot of control equipment involved. Now, if you make a big scale battery like this one, which is maybe in the megawatt or gigawatt hour size, you will have a hell of a lot of these small cells and a hell of a lot of equipment to hook up everything and make it work. So how would it work? Well, we saw this day to begin with, where we had the load, that was the blue curve, and the production from wind and solar is the red curve. What we would have to do is then discharge our battery in the morning to make up for the shortcoming. And then when we got an excess of power, we can start charging our battery again. How much do we need? Well, this is how you would calculate it. Here we have a demand which is fairly steady at 400 megawatts. You have generation which starts out at some maybe 600, 500 megawatts, then it drops to 0, and then it comes back in the afternoon up. The two only match at this point and this point here, and meanwhile you would need your battery. And now you can calculate how much battery capacity you would need just to fill this gap here. So you have a roughly 8 hours and roughly 400 megawatts, and you multiply the two, and you get that your battery size should be minimum 3,200 megawatt hours. Of course, you need a lot more when you take more days into account, but just in this case here, it's 3,200 megawatt hours, which is actually quite a lot. How big is the biggest battery in the world? That's called Edwards and Sanborn in California. It has a capacity of 875 megawatts. Now, when you see articles in the newspapers, on the media, on batteries, normally they will show the megawatt. Oh, it's got 100 megawatts, it's got 500 megawatts. It's huge. And in this case, it's 875, so it's even bigger. But what is interesting is, this means that this is the amount of power that it could supply here and now per second. But for how long can it supply? And this is what is really interesting. That is the number of megawatt hours, which tells you something about for how many hours could it supply. And in this case, it's less than 4 hours that we could get the power at full blast. Of course, at lower, you can get it for a longer time. But you can say that the California, this is in California, so the Californian consumption is on average 30,000 megawatts. The load or the demand then per hour would be 30,000 megawatt hours per hour. So you can see now that the capacity of this huge battery is only 2.9% of California's demand.
But so the average doesn't tell the story.
No, but we get back to that.
Okay.
And you can see that the battery would only be able to supply California for 11 minutes. So if you have a Dunkelflaute of some days, sorry guys, this is not the battery that will help you. This is for the whole of a year recently, where you see the demand, and then you see wind and solar. And here they have added up, I mean, I think this is more than the wind and solar in California can supply today, but they have added solar cells and windmills on paper until the two match. So the combined production of all the year will match the combined load of all the year. And again, you see this imbalance. Sometimes you produce a lot more than you need, and sometimes you produce a lot less. So this is what we see now. California has a lot of solar cells, so especially in the wintertime, they are hard hit. They cannot really reach the consumption. But if you take a picture like this, then we can now calculate how big should my battery be. And I can do that just by subtracting the load from the production, and then I get surplus and deficit, and then by adding up over the year, I can see how big should my battery be. And this is what you see here. Here you see the deficit, that's in the winter months, and you have a huge surplus in the summer months. And then again, you can translate into how much do you need to have stored in order to cater for the need. Here the need is, we need initially to have something in our battery because we have to cater, we have to supply power all the way through until mid-March. So we need to start out with some 10,000 gigawatt hours, they have calculated. We can allow it to drop to zero at this point here because now our production is taking over. Then we start to charge our battery, and we charge and we charge, and then we start consuming again. And towards the end of the year, we have consumed, so we are back to the starting point. And the capacity needed for our battery will then be the maximum figure that you see here. If you want to solve this situation here and ensure a stable supply, then you need to have a battery of this size, which is roughly 25,000 gigawatt hours. And then you need for losses, and you need extra for variations between the years. So basically you need more than that. But in this case, we will take the 25 gigawatt hours, 25,000 gigawatt hours.
Soren, is that where you're draining the battery down to zero, or is it down to some sort of 50% rate on the battery?
This is down to zero.
To zero. So you destroy the battery then?
Yes, and that of course is the next problem, that a battery should preferably be operated between 20 and 80% load. So if you take that in here, you can more or less double the size. But we don't do that because this is just a calculating example. And when we get the final figure, we can always add whatever we want to add. It doesn't look better when we do that. Price for batteries in grid scale was in the period 2013, 2018, around $1,500 per kilowatt hour. In 2024, and this is this huge battery here, it was in Sanborn. They have given a price from which I can calculate roughly $350 per kilowatt hour. I think that's low because I've seen prices on other projects where it's a bit higher than that. But let's take that. Here, some of you might protest because if you look at some of these articles where they foresee the development in battery costs, they talk about, oh, we will soon be below $100 per kilowatt hour. Yes, we will for the battery on their own, maybe. But in order to make a grid scale project like this one here, you need a lot of other equipment. You need a lot of copper wiring, you need all the control equipment, you need the transformers, everything. And then when you add all that up, then this price of $350 per kilowatt hour is actually quite low. So let's stick to that and see where we end up. We just saw that we needed 25,000 gigawatt hours, which is equivalent to 25 billion kilowatt hours, which gives us a total investment around $9 trillion. And just for comparison, the gross domestic product of California is around $3.7 trillion. So to put it mildly, that doesn't fly. And if now you talk about you want to be nice to your battery and you want some extra capacity, so maybe we double this one here, then we are talking about $18 trillion. And even if the cost got further down than 350, which I don't think they do, because copper is in short supply and the prices of copper are not coming down. And what kind of technological development could work around copper? Yeah, you can use aluminum, but that gives you a lot of other problems. So basically, you don't get much below these figures here. So battery on a national scale will not fly for economical reasons. Hydrogen, which is produced by electrolysis. There are different methods, and we don't need to go into that, but basically you put power into a cup of water, and you have the two electrodes, and up along one will the oxygen come, and up along the other one will the hydrogen come. And oxygen you just let out into the air. There's not much use for that. Hydrogen you will store, and then you have a fuel, a very efficient fuel. And in this way, you have converted your electricity, and especially your surplus electricity, you have now converted into what could be useful fuel. An example of how to use hydrogen, Toyota has had the Mirai for many years. It has a hydrogen tank which can store 5 kilograms of hydrogen, which will give the car a range of 600 kilometers. But this hydrogen, in order for it not to take up too much space, you need to store it at a pressure of 700 bars. That is the equivalent of going 7 kilometers down into the ocean. So that's very high pressure. And yet, at this high pressure, the volume will still be 150 liters, and the weight of the whole thing will be 87 kilograms. For comparison, gasoline-driven or petrol-driven car would need 40 liters of petrol, which would weigh 28 kilos, and the total weight, including the tank, would be 40 kilos. Actually, there is no storage that beats a tank full of liquid fuel. The only thing that's better is nuclear, but that's of course something different. And when you want to use hydrogen for your car, you have some significant losses along the way. Just the electrolysis, you will lose 20 to 30%. Then you handle your hydrogen, you store it, you handle it again, and you end up that actually you only for your hydrogen car have maybe around 40% of what you originally produced. If you use a battery electric car, at least you can use, or maybe you can utilize up to 90% of the power. So very big losses in connection with the hydrogen as a fuel. Hydrogen is a safety issue. It's very difficult to handle. The hydrogen molecule is very small. It will seep out through anything you can think of, even steel walls, pipes, and so on. It can make them brittle, explore little cracks, and then it'll seep out. And it's highly flammable and explosive, of course. This is a picture of an actual hydrogen explosion somewhere. You can store it under high pressure, as I mentioned, up to 700 bars. You have the option of liquefying it, but then you need to go down to minus 258 degrees centigrade, which is, of course, very costly, and you need cooling and also a little bit of pressure. So it's not easy to handle hydrogen. So the next step is, of course, to produce what we call power to X, which are synthetic fuels based on hydrogen as one component. Then you can combine it with carbon dioxide, and you could produce gasoline, methanol, or methane gas, or natural gas. Methanol is the most straightforward process. I think that's the one that many of these people are aiming at. But of course, you need a source of CO2. And that could be from the chimney of a plant, power plant, or some heavy industry, cement plant, for instance. But you need to be sure, because this is quite a big investment, the CO2 collection, you need to be sure that the plant where you put it on will continue to operate, which means that a coal-fired plant is maybe not a good idea if there are political plans to shut down the plant within the next 5 years. So when you look at these big calculating spreadsheets that the Danish Climate Council is operating on, getting enough CO2 is actually a major problem. Where should it come from? The only viable solution is to capture it from air, what we call direct air capture. But if you do that, it will be very expensive, because there's very little carbon dioxide in the air, and you will have a lot of costs in energy, investments, and so on to get the CO2 out. So you end up with some pretty expensive fuels here. An alternative is to react the hydrogen with nitrogen. And nitrogen you can pull out of the air easily enough. That's a well-known process. And then you can produce ammonia. And ammonia is a very well-known synthesis, which is done in huge volumes today. Nitrogen comes from the air. The hydrogen comes from natural gas. And then you produce ammonia primarily for fertilizer, but also for other purposes. Ammonia can be used as fuel for, say, ships. They have some experimental engines for that purpose. You can also split the ammonia again after transportation and get the hydrogen out and use that. But again, it's a costly process. So now let's get into the costs. The Danish Energy Board have issued what they call a technology catalog, where they describe all kinds of energy solutions and technologies, except nuclear. Nuclear is not mentioned for political reasons, but everything else. And in there, you can also find costs or projected costs for offshore wind. And they are saying that in 2020, the cost was around 45 euro per megawatt hours. It is expected to fall down at least to 40 by 2050, but that is without learning. But if we learn, if we get more and more clever at building offshore wind turbines, then the price might drop down all the way to 30 euro per megawatt hours. And at that costs, then maybe you could consider looking at producing hydrogen and using this for all kinds of purposes. But what are the realities? In the UK, we have just had a round of bidding for offshore projects. It was not a huge success because some offshore farms, there were no bidders. There were actually only bids when the farms were adjacent to other farms which the bidder already owned, so they could share infrastructure and so on. And yet, still, the guaranteed prices, and these are contracts for difference, so these are guaranteed prices which either the consumers or the government will pay in all eternity to the windmill operator. They were around 100 euro per megawatt hours, more than 80 British pounds per megawatt hour. And this is what we see. They even talk about floating wind turbines, because these are with fixed foundations on the seabed. But when the level or the sea level is higher, then you need floating, and floating is even more expensive. Then we're talking 150 to 200 euro per megawatt hour. So power will be expensive in the future, no matter what we do. So what happens if we then look at the cost of hydrogen? Well, if we say that if the cost per kilowatt hour is 10 euro cent, that was 100 euro per megawatt hour, and we know that we need 50 kilowatt hours of power to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. This is basic physics. There are some losses involved, and this is an optimistic figure because right now it's higher. And you can have more sophisticated technology, so maybe you could bring this one down to 45 or even 40, but no less than that. I would say not less than 45. But let's say 50. That means that the power expense for your hydrogen alone will be 5 euro per kilogram of hydrogen. Then you have other costs, and they have been calculated to be roughly 40% of the total price. So the total cost of your hydrogen will be 8 euro per kilogram. There was actually one small project in the UK where there was a guaranteed price, again a contract for difference with the government, and they were offered 9.5 euro per kilogram. So we are in this ballpark, 8 to 9.5 euro for green hydrogen. And then we need to know that the market price for hydrogen produced from natural gas is around 1.8 euro per kilogram. That's why I've drawn this safe. You need to store your hydrogen, your green hydrogen, in a safe because it's very expensive. Now, there have been big plans in Denmark. We are supposed to have a huge surplus of solar and wind, like you saw in the beginning. And all the excessive power is to be used for producing hydrogen. And there have been plans for big hydrogen plants as well. And from these plants, there should be a pipeline going to the German border. And the Germans will pick up the hydrogen, and then they will use it in their power plants or in their industry. And the plans were very much advanced at a certain stage. Now everybody is backpedaling a little bit because I think that the figures that you see here are gradually also coming to the attention of the politicians and the decision makers. Because the fact is, if we supply hydrogen from Denmark at a cost of 8 euro per kilogram, and this is a low price because this is optimized production in all aspects, that corresponds to 240 euro per megawatt hour. Now, German industry, they use natural gas, chemical industry. They use natural gas to a great extent. They pay now around 40 euro per megawatt hour, which is a fairly high price because just at the beginning of this year, it was down to 20 euro per megawatt hour. That's coming up and down. But you can see there's a huge difference to 240. And what happens in Germany now is that energy is becoming so expensive that they are closing down some of their production lines. BASF in Ludwigshafen, the big chemical producer, they have closed down some 5 or 6 big production lines because there's no market. They cannot compete with the Chinese or with the Americans who have access to much cheaper electric power and gas. And this situation will not be helped if we start basing it on hydrogen instead. The second thing was that Germany wants to invest in a string of gas-fired power plants. They are to be converted into hydrogen within a few years. Again, Danish hydrogen. Now we have a small issue because there doesn't really exist a hydrogen burner which you can use in a power plant, but that has to be developed because hydrogen burns at a very high temperature, so it tends to melt everything around it. But never mind. Now, power from a hydrogen power plant would cost, because you have a 50% loss along the way, it would cost around 500 euro per megawatt hour. And power prices in Germany were 40 euro per megawatt hour back in 1920. Now it's up around 80, which is a very high price for power, but still much, much lower than this one here. And again, the Germans have to compete with the rest of the world. And with energy prices like this, there is no way that their manufacturing and chemical industries, cement and steel and whatever, can continue to operate. Here's a scenario for Denmark. 2035 is a little different from the other one you saw, but never mind. What you see here is the expected production from renewables, which again is solar and wind, and the consumption of power. And this is a month, or no, it's 3 weeks from June, July 2035. The consumption is higher than the present. One reason is that we are getting a lot of these data centers, Microsoft and Google and whatnot, where they make artificial intelligence and searches and whatever, and they need a dead steady power supply. So there's no flexible demand there at all. So this is the consumption, and this is the production. And now, of course, either by imports or by hydrogen, we have to fill in the gaps here in between. But if you subtract the two from each other, then you have a picture of the surplus power. And this is a surplus power that we intend to use for power to X, for making hydrogen or maybe some of these fuels I showed you. And now you can see the power which is available, which fluctuates up and down, up and down. I don't know if any of you have any experience with chemical industry. I have. If you want to run a chemical process, you need dead steady conditions. That is really the secret to get a good yield out of your equipment, a good capacity factor. And as you can see, first of all, we would need a huge plant because it should be able to cater up to 25,000 megawatts. So we need a lot of electrolyzers which can use all this power. But they're not used very often. Most of them would have to be switched off because there's much less power for most of the time. And then again, you have to operate your equipment on power that's coming up and down, up and down. Now, my guess is that this is not possible. The Chinese are trying. They have somewhere in Xinjiang, in the western part of China, they have built a plant, an electrolyzer plant for making hydrogen, and it's based on solar cells. They get a little bit of wind power from outside, but it's basically based on a solar park, which means that they get power in the morning, it starts up, and in the evening it shuts down. And they have been running, they have had huge problems with the process. What happens, among other things, is that I showed you the electrolyzer where you have oxygen coming out one side and hydrogen the other side. Now the two should not be mixed because then you have an explosive mixture immediately. And that's what happened in the electrolyzers when the conditions are not optimal. And actually some hydrogen will seep in and mix with the oxygen, which is very dangerous. So they've had to restrict the production, and the first year of operation, they made only 20% of what the plant was designed for or calculated for. So this is an uphill battle, and my feeling is that this will never work. And it will especially not work if you want to take the next step and produce ammonia or methanol or whatever, because then you are really into chemical industry, and that has to run dead steady or it won't run at all. So to conclude, and then you can ask questions afterwards, the intended role of solar and wind in Denmark and in many other countries is that it should cater for the supply of electricity, all of the electricity, and we should also be able to produce fuels so we can cover the other energy needs of the community. But solar and wind fluctuates wildly. And the dream is that it could be solved by batteries or by hydrogen or power to X. But the fact is that the batteries are far too expensive and they will continue to be so. And hydrogen, in my best opinion, will never work. So I think the green transition will fail. And I think we are already getting closer because the problems are piling up and there are no really good solutions for them. That was all from my side.
Excellent. Thank you, Soren. That was one of the best we've ever had.
Oh, thank you.
And it's just because you make it so clear, and stuff that we think and generalize, you've got nailed down to the, to the small degrees, and you've really thought it out. So we really appreciate that.